All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Caitlin Cavan and I work with Conservation Nebraska. A little background of Conservation Nebraska is that we are a nonprofit organization that is funded by AmeriCorps, and our mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement. Today we have Gary Lesoing speaking over cover crops, which is beneficial to our soil, and there's a ton of other different benefits that he will cover. Gary works as an extension educator for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in the Southeast Research and Extension District in Nemaha County. I won't speak too much for him, and I'll let him give you more of a little background about himself. Before I let Gary take over, we do have a quick survey before we start over cover crops that we would appreciate if you participated in. Your participation in this survey helps with our grant funding, and you'll be entered into a gift card drawing that we will do at the end of each month. The same survey will be presented to you at the end of the event to see if you learned anything from Gary's presentation. Participating in the end survey will also give you another chance to win a gift card. You'll be entered twice. Your cameras are turned off and you are muted just in case anyone is uncomfortable with being recorded, as we do record these sessions. If you have any questions, type them in the chat and Gary will get to them at the end of the presentation. If everyone has answered the survey, I think I will turn the event over to Gary. So Gary, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, wait just a second here. Okay, let me go back here. Trying to get back to where. Let me see here. Start again. Okay, here we go. Now keep going to this one screen. Okay, sorry for our delay. My name is Gary Lesoing. As I said, I work for the University of Nebraska, extension educator down in the southeast corner. And the last 10 years or so, I've been working a lot with cover crops and soil health. I have a background in sustainable ag. I worked at a research center by Mead, Nebraska for several years before I was with Extension, and did some work with sustainable agriculture and organic farming, organic crops, and did some research in that area and looking at diversified cropping systems. So that's kind of my background, and just going to talk about some benefits of cover crops, and there's some challenges for people using them, but a lot of people are learning about the benefits of cover crops, and a lot of the things we've learned from farmers that have tried them and see the benefits of that. So without further ado, I'll get started. And one of the things, there's pretty much four different areas that we've shown that's been beneficial for cover crops. Some of these, like the soil health, covers a lot of different topics, and we'll get into those as we move forward. But the biggest one probably that we've seen a lot of, I said, torrential rains and these extreme weather events, in 2019, the bomb cyclone and some of these things but where we did have, cover crops growing, it helped hold the soil a lot better. And that's what we're seeing. Sometimes we're getting these huge rainfall events of, 7, 8, 10 inches. I know they had a large, rain up there in Omaha, this summer, about 6 inches. And down in the southeast corner, around by Fall City, Rulo, Nebraska, they had like 10 inches one night. So these huge rainfall events really cause a lot of erosion. And if you have it covered with a cover crop, that helps protect the soil a lot in there. So that's something you see a lot of and just driving through the country. So we like to see the soil covered. And that's one of the things like the NRCS, Natural Resource and Conservation Service has shown that, by keeping living root in the soil as much of the year as possible, it's going to be beneficial. And there's a heck of a lot more that needs to be learned, but the University of Nebraska and a lot of other universities and other organizations are doing a lot of research and trying to learn as much as possible as they can to protect the soil and looking at how cover crops can be beneficial. The other thing is the soil health. There's a lot of things where it helps that way, and then suppress weeds. A lot of things, we don't want to use a lot of chemicals, but weeds are a major issue, and there's so much happening with in regard to, I guess, people that are using pesticides. A lot of times the weeds are resistant to them because they use them too much. They build up resistance, and it doesn't do any good to spray them. So, but a lot of times cover crops are successful in suppressing weeds. And then the last one is forage production. In Nebraska, we have a lot of livestock, and that is one thing that's really shown to be beneficial. The people that have livestock, they're the people that have really kind of taken on with the use of cover crops, and people have been planting. They didn't call them cover crops back then. They, over 20 years ago, they just call them annual forages. And there used to be a lot more wheat grown in the area, but now corn and soybeans are more profitable. So most of the farmers are planting more of them, and there's a lot less wheat being grown or cereal crops. So now not so much of that's planted, but some people are still planting wheat just to be able to use cover crops in systems, and they can graze those or harvest them as a forage. And the people that are doing that are seeing a lot of benefits in their soil, and then also as a forage for their livestock, and it's been profitable in their operations. So we'll just kind of get started looking at things. Like I said, mentioned erosion, something you can see, from the road, or you're driving down the road. And this is a picture. This was actually probably taken over 20-some years ago. We were actually doing some research with cover crops up at the research center near Mead, Nebraska. That's kind of halfway between Lincoln and Omaha, but the university has a facility. It's about 9,600 acres total. But we were doing research in, sustainable agriculture and the use of cover crops back in the late 90s. And these cover crops up at the top, you can see that cereal rye growing. That was actually flown on with an airplane in in September, and we planted it in September. We got about an inch of rain the next night, and it all come up. It was under irrigation, but we didn't have to irrigate it. And this is the next spring in April, and I keep this picture because this shows, and there is kind of a light soil. There's some sandy soil in there, but it's been grazed. You can see some manure from the cattle up there, but you can see where the rye is growing. It's held the soil a lot better. And this was after, like in April, we had an inch and a half of rain on this field. And here, where there's no rye growing, you see it's eroding and causing erosion to occur. So, I mean, this was back 20 years ago when we were just kind of learning about cover crops. And now, we should say when cover crops weren't cool back then, but now it's another thing. And this is a field south of Lincoln, Nebraska, a farmer that has done some on-farm research. We have an extensive on-farm research program at the university, and you have over 100 on-farm experiments with farmers throughout the state. And the farmers usually decide what they want to look at and work with extension educators or researchers on these things. But this is a field south of Lincoln, Nebraska. And after a huge rainfall in the spring of the year.
Hey, Gary.
Yes.
So sorry to interrupt you. Could you try sharing your screen again? I think it stops sharing the time that you went in there and scrolled to the first slide.
Okay. Brother. Try again. Okay, let's see here. Start over.
Perfect. Sorry about that, Gary.
So is that, can you just, I mean, is that the way, well, do I have to? I think I got to put it in this.
Perfect.
Is it sharing it now?
Yep.
And now?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see the different slide. Okay. But this site here, there was cereal rye growing here in the spring of the year, and then some brassicas like turnips and radishes, and they sprayed them out and they're going to plant in there. But you can see, there's no erosion. This was after like a 9-inch rain they had in like 2015 in here. But you can see over on the right corner across the draw there, the ditch there, you can see there's a gully that they call it ephemeral erosion. And that's a common sight you'll see with a tilled field after you get a big storm. And then we've seen a lot of those the last 3 or 4 years on those things. And this was, well, maybe about 10 miles away down in southern Lancaster County. I mean, this is a no-till field where they don't do any tillage, but corn's been planted in that. But this is after maybe they got 5 or 6 inches of rain here at one time, and see these huge ruts in the field after that rain. And, this hasn't been tilled up or anything, but still erosion happens. And, but that's why cover crops can really are beneficial in controlling that. And then here's another one. It's not such a steep field, but it's been tilled up, and then they planted a field with corn, and you can see all the erosion, and that's very good topsoil. And well, there's a lot, if this happens all over, when we get these big rains, lose a lot of productive. I mean, the topsoil is the most productive and most fertile, and that's where you lose a lot of organic matter, and your production will get down over time. So anything you do to keep that soil on the ground, on the land, the better. But one thing they can do, and there's actually a program with the NRCS to prevent these gullies. A lot of these fields have these small gullies in there. So if you go in there and they go in there and kind of fill them in with a blade, and then plant cereal rye in that, and that's a lot of people have done. And then the rye will come up and kind of make it, they call it an annual waterway rather than, rye is a pretty hardy crop. I mean, you can plant that now, and it'll come up, even in the fall, as long as it has some moisture. But even if it comes up later on in the spring, it'll still benefit when we get these rains and hold the soil. Has a very extensive root system. And this is just an example, where they drilled the rye in there and it's coming up and it's holding the soil. There's corn planted between there. And then this is just another field, but after a while, then they'll spray it out with Roundup, a chemical that the corn is resistant, so it's not going to hurt the corn, but it'll kill that rye, and then the corn will come up through there. And but to protect the soil, it'll play a cover to protect the soil all summer long in there. And they may have to do that every year, but at least they're holding the soil in there, and through time it should help heal those gullies type of thing. You can do it with oats too. And here they did it where they got corn growing in there, but they planted us oats here in the spring of the year. And these are several fields around in the eastern Nebraska where they did this. And this is the same oat field, but this is after getting a 2.4-inch rain. And, the corn has grown up, in 3-week period, but the oats have held the soil in there. And then, after doing that, you can spray the oats out and then, it'll hold the soil type of thing. But this is like a neighborhood after that rain, and see, it's making a gully there where there's no rye to protect it. So the one thing, there is a program Nebraska has through their NRCS offices throughout the state where they can, get some funding to help for the ephemeral gully repair. And they can get, like money to buy some seed and maybe the cost of, drilling the seed in regard to that. So there are opportunities there for people that need benefit there. Another major benefit of cover crops is improving soil health. And one of the things, improves water infiltration in the soil. And by doing that, and also the water holding capacity, how much water the soil hold. And that, the faster the water goes in, when we get these big rains, it'll soak in a lot better. And so it's something that doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time for the soil to improve, but it will happen. And then, so that's one thing that's beneficial with cover crops. A lot of the roots, when you grow a cover crop in there, there's a lot of different root systems. And even if you have one like cereal rye, the rye is going to die. And then, these holes will, the roots, this will decay. And there's a lot of, like biological activity in the soil, bacteria and fungi in the soil, and then also like earthworms as well. And so there'll be a lot of pore spaces in the soil, for when we do get rains, water come through. And recycle nutrients. This helps recycle different nutrients. A lot of the, they call them root exudates that come off the soil. They help the soil bind together so it holds the soil better in regard to that. Then conserving moisture. I said, well, how can it conserve moisture? And that's probably one of the biggest things here in Nebraska, where rain, especially under dryland conditions, where rainfall can be limited. We have drought conditions, especially the farther west you go. It can get really dry, but protecting the soil is huge, and the moisture. But it's going to take moisture for the crop to get up there. But after like the crop, like you roll down the rye or kill it off, it's gonna, make a covering over the soil to keep the soil cooler and conserve the moisture. And actually one time, a couple of years ago, you may recall, it was helping the erosion. We were talking about water erosion, but also wind erosion, the farther west where it's drier conditions. But we had if you remember the situation, I think is out by York, where actually I think a person was killed on the interstate because of the dust, so much dust from the fields that weren't protected. They were well tilled up. And a lot of times now, I just came back from Kearney, Nebraska, earlier this afternoon. And a lot of the farmers, they grow a lot of seed corn out there. And the farmers, I think a lot of the companies are requiring that, but they'll grow turnips, a lot of turnips and radishes, this type of thing. And they have root systems that go down deep into the soil. And one thing, they help scavenge a lot of the nitrogen out, because they put a lot of nitrogen on the crop to protect the groundwater, and they help do that. But also it's a lot of good forage. There's cattle out there grazing, but that'll protect the soil, and we get those winds in the springtime, and conserve the moisture as well. And you can plant legumes. They're nitrogen fixers. They'll take nitrogen out of the air, and they can add nitrogen to the soil. Like different types of legumes are like some different clovers and vetches, like soybeans, alfalfa, and even like, in the summer type, like cowpeas, and some of these. There's several different types. But if you let these grow and then, either graze them, you can recycle the nutrients in there. Over time, they will add carbon and organic matter to the soil. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to do that. And I should say increased biological activity. There's a lot more fungi and earthworm activity that you'll see over time. We talked about water infiltration, and I did some research, and this is something that actually, I mean, farmers could do this, or I had like a irrigation pipe, a 5-inch irrigation pipe, I guess it's probably 6-inch, and cut it about a 6-inch section, then pound it in the ground about 3 inches, and then it's about, I think about 400, almost 450 milliliters approximately, is equivalent to about an inch of water on the soil, and pour that on there, and then you kind of time it, see how long it takes to run in. Usually put on the first inch, kind of to standardize the different treatments. And you do that, I did that over several, at least four or six different places in this field. So I had a field that was no-till. It's probably been no-till for 10 years down in Nemaha County where I work. And then another one where I had no-till using cover crops. And they had a no-till where they had cover crops, and they had cattle grazing, and cattle were in this one area a lot. So there was a lot of manure. So the area was pretty more fertile as we went on. And so I took this infiltration rates on these several different observations, and on the average, the no-till, which is actually, that's pretty good for no-till, but a lot of times it's only maybe a half an inch an hour on average. And with the cover crops, that increased it. And then the cover crops with the manure, it increased even more yet. And actually, some of these places I've got higher yet. They do a number of readings over a field, and sometimes they get up to over, maybe 15 inches an hour. And a lot of that has to do, if you get a lot of wormholes in the area, that's going to increase your infiltration rate. And I do know the one field where we're doing some research has a tremendous amount of worms on there, so that's going to make a difference. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the soil organic matter, when we add the organic matter from the cover crop, I mean, that's just extra plant material that we're putting back on, or if we're grazing it, the cattle will just mainly recycle it through their manure, and it'll go back on the land. But see, the no-till is 3.3%, which is very good by itself, but no-till plus cover crops is 4.5%, and then the no-till plus cover crops with manure is about 5%. And this is, 5 is like you would have if you had a really good garden. That's excellent, like garden soil, is real productive. And a lot of times, a lot of the soils, are a lot lower than if it's a sandy soil, it's, maybe down to 1 something. But I know a lot of the growers, they was in that 4.5 or over 4% range where they have done cover crops with no-till for a long time. As a producer down in Gage County and Saline County, there's a couple different ones where it was almost 5% where they had been doing it 8 to 10 years. And another one was like 4%, but it was pretty much continuous where they were, grazing their cattle on it and doing cover crops. So it's something, it's kind of have to buy into the system, and it takes patience too, but they are seeing some benefits there over time. And it usually ends up with getting, extra yields over time. But this is like a field in southeast Nebraska where these growers, they do cover crops maybe every other year into soy when they plant their soybeans. And corn, it's a little more challenging because of, sometimes you're planting your corn earlier usually, and a lot of times you're concerned about competition with the corn and drying the soil out. But some people that have kind of mastered this are had found out some of the benefits of it and making it work. But these guys actually have irrigation where they can put on here too, but they plant what we call plant green. They plant it into the soybeans, and they kill the soybeans with a chemical and then the soybeans up and go through here. And you can see, a lot of the cover they have. So if they do, I mean, this part's pretty flat, but there is a hill on the other side you can't see that really benefits over when we do have big rains and stuff for erosion control. But the big thing, another thing, they suppress weeds here, really suppresses weeds a lot and reduces the amount herbicide needed. And the other thing is protects the soil, but keeps it cooler. Cooler when in the summertime when it gets hot. And that's one thing. Actually did some measurements, and this actually the air temperature is about 90, I don't know, 93, 94, something like that. So where we had it covered, it was like 80 degrees, and this is about 4-inch depth of the soil thermometer down in the soil temperature was 80. And here in the bare soil, I mean, in the same field, we out by the entrance to the field there, it was bare, and it was 100 degrees. So it was a 20 degrees difference. And this is pretty typical. I mean, it's usually ranges from 15 to 20 degrees cooler where it's covered with a cover crop. So this is benefit, but it also reduces the amount of, we call evapotranspiration that you lose, and that's going to affect your yield. And then when you get these little rains, it helps take those in and benefit from the crop will benefit from some of those. So it's going to help in the long run overall. And I mentioned earlier about the fields where we had a lot of earthworm activity. Well, these, what you call middings, are basically the earthworms' homes. And this is where we have a long-term, well, this is the 5th year of this study, but it was a soil demonstration site that we had in Nemaha County. The farmer is working with the NRCS and as part of our on-farm research program. But you can see all the earthworm activity. And I think what they were figuring with all this activity was, almost about like they had like the equivalent of like 5 cows grazing or something like that, because of the activity of the earthworms, all their eating up their cover crop residue on that. And this wasn't such an issue because this part of the experiment was kind of in the bottom, so it didn't really hurt. But there's tremendous amount of earthworms here. And then this last year, I did a kind of a survey to find out how many earthworms you might have in this area. So I dug up like basically a cubic foot is 12 inches by 12 inches and 12 inches deep. And there's like 43,560 square foot in an acre. And it ranged from like, well, I think 10 earthworms I found in the sample with the least number, up to 35 earthworms in the sample with the most number. So if you multiply that 35 times the 43,560, it's about 1.5 million earthworms in that acre of soil. And so tremendous amount of activity. And we had excellent yields on this part of the field because there's good soil anyway, but a lot of activity going on there. And you can see, and they hold the soil. It helps a lot of the things that keep it from eroding. And one thing I did want to see, these cover crop roots going down. So this was a few years ago, actually in Richardson County in the southeast corner of the state, where I had a mechanical soil probe and there's cereal rye growing. The cereal rye was about 3 foot tall. It was in April 15th. And I planted like the rye in September 15th approximately. And I found cereal rye roots down like 6 feet, 10 inches in the soil. So basically it grew over the winter time. And there was snow was cover crops and there was snow covering. So the ground didn't really freeze, but the cover crops kept growing all the way down through the winter time. And I did another field in Odo County. It was about 6 foot 6 inches. That was a couple of years ago. And this year, so there's a lot of activity going on all through the winter. And that's one of the things NRCS wants to have a live root in the soil all year round. This is a field in Odo County. And the thing they call roller crimper, a lot of the organic producers use this machine. It rolls down the rye Now you wouldn't have to use any chemical on that because once you roll it when it's actually blooming and a lot of pollen in the air, but then if you roll it then the rye won't come back in there. I know they did some herbicides on this, but very little, but it did excellent weed control. And soybeans are planted in there, and they were they rolled it about, I think, maybe 5 days after they planted it. Those were coming up, but it really didn't hurt that much when they roller crimped it. And this was the summer later. They had, excellent, or later in the summer, I should say, in August. And that was like the first part of June where they were roller crimping it. And this was like the head of the NRCS came out and looked at this field in there. But what's ironic, there's because some of the rye actually was viable, it came up, and there's actually a rye growing down there, so kind of reseeded itself in there. I mean, they did have a dry spell in the summer, and it did affect the soybean yields. They weren't, what they had hoped to be. They had some yield drag because of the drier weather they had, but had excellent weed control, and it reduced the amount of herbicides they needed. But a lot of good cover. This is a field that's been in cover crops for several years there. And then I mentioned about weed control, some of the things. One of the weeds, mare's tail, a lot of it is resistant to glyphosate or Roundup and a lot of different herbicides. So it's a winter annual, comes up in the fall, and if you it goes in the spring, and if you let it grow, it kind of comes up as a rosette stage. But if you let it make a stem or bolt, they call that, then it's really hard to get rid of in regard to that. But here's where, they didn't have any rye growing, and look at how thick the stand is. But where they had the rye growing, it really suppressed it, and there's hardly anything there. And that's a pretty common occurrence, pretty common, I should say. Pretty much all the farmers I talked to have found similar results, that they say it's excellent at suppressing, almost right to the row where they have the cereal rye growing. And another weed that's showing up good is to prevent it is what's called Palmer amaranth, which is a very invasive weed here in Nebraska. But Kansas State's done a lot of research, and Nebraska is doing some as well both with rye and with just a cereal like wheat as well. They're very good at suppressing the germination of the Palmer amaranth and also the growth of it, and some benefit there, actually being able to control it better if they plant that as a cover crop. So there's a lot of benefits there. That's a terrible weed, and keep it away. With corn, there's a lot more challenges because corn takes a lot of water early on, and some people are more until they really master it. They're maybe killing the rye at maybe a foot tall, and maybe not getting all the benefit, but at least they're suppressing weeds and keeping the soil cooler and cover that way, and they're still getting some benefits that way as well. But the people that are doing wheat in their system, this is actually at in the university's research farm, the Rogers Farm, conservation farm, about 10 miles east of Lincoln. And on the left is like a big 14-way diversified mix planted after wheat. Paul Yassa, this is from his field, a courtesy of him. And but he has some research projects where he has rye or just cover crops growing after wheat, and you can see the benefits there. There's no weeds growing on the left side. On the right side, where there's several different weeds coming up, and he plants right. I mean, even like to the day after he harvests, he'll plant as soon as he can, because there's still some moisture there in the soil, but you get it planted as soon as possible. And then a lot of people, like I mentioned about people planting the forage, or like this is turnips after wheat. I'm sorry, after corn or field corn, or else after seed corn as well. And they'll plant it as early as they can. Sometimes they'll fly it on with an airplane to get it in the ground, but it brings up and helps recycle nutrients, but also provides forage and protects the soil from erosion. And this just shows an example, a lot of that. And then, but also a good forage for grazing, and even some people, this was down in Gage County, they graze it. This is actually, I think, been planted already. He pulls his cattle off right, went through here with a planter, and then there is some irrigation. Can't irrigate this field, but the warm farmer there, he's done a lot of grazing with his cattle, with cereal rye in the springtime, and very beneficial there. And here it just shows, I mean, the rye grows very fast, but he has the cattle out there, so they're keeping the vegetative state, and it's excellent forage, very high in protein, very high in digestibility, and getting a tremendous amount of benefit from that. And that's how, like I said, the people that are doing livestock are really seeing the benefits of cover crop, and it's improving their soil health as well at the same time. In some areas, the people have corn and bean rotations or continuous corn. This is kind of out more in central Nebraska, well, especially like around York and between York and Grand Island area. This is actually, they're interseeding into the corn. They're interseeding the cover crops between the corn rows with this seeder. There's a big hopper up top there where they're doing that. And then this shows kind of a diversified mix planting in there. And they're doing a lot of research on that, several different sites. And we have a on-farm research study book that we put out, and it's available online. But if you go to that, you can find out information on how these things perform. It's kind of a work in progress, experimenting with what species work better. They're working with the Nature Conservancy out in, I think, central Nebraska. It's a project they're working on at several different sites, and sometimes they'll plant different, like warm season legumes like cowpea. And the one type of cowpea is very, I should say, aggressive. And last year, when they had a lot of, not summer before, when they had some wind damage, the cowpeas, a lot of them broke off, and the cowpeas just, they went kind of crazy up on the corn stalks, and really kind of took it over. So there was some yield loss on this. But a lot of times, and you have to be careful what kind of herbicides you use, because a lot of them are very sensitive. So people are still trying to learn about this and some of the benefits they have on this, and it'll be interesting to see where this goes. I know the people that are organic, they're having a lot better luck with this, because they're not worrying about the herbicides, and they're playing in there and having some better luck with that. And I mentioned about this soil health demonstration field in Nemaha County. I'm just going to show you some of the results on here. And this is a field where we have a wheat, corn, and soybeans growing in these fields. We have different rotation. And a farmer, Daryl Obermeyer, he wanted to look at, he works with NRCS, and they're a project they have, and working with their on-farm research project. They have several of these throughout the state. I think there are 17 of these on-farm research project. And then this is on the far of that project where they're grazing. There's on some of it, they had oats planted with brassicas, turnips, and radishes, and they had rye planted with turnips and radishes. We did find out that where the taller grown, that's oats growing, they come up and compete a lot better than the rye, and where it's kind of flat down, that's rye planted. He wanted to look at how that affected the next year's crop, if they had any effect on that, by having one that winter killed and one that was winter hardy. So that's what he was looking at. But you can see the difference. The one with the oats, it grew up a lot more early on. But one thing he did find, he got a lot of good grazing from both the rye and the oats, as far as that goes. But some of the projects that they're looking at impact of grazing on the crop yields, impact the cover crops on soil health and water quality, different cover crop seeding rates, the impact of interseeding crops on crop yields. That's what I just showed you earlier on. And then different maturities of corn and soybeans, And one thing is they're looking at early returning corn so they can get in there and plant the cover crops early. And same with soybeans, and see how the economics looks on these type of systems. And over time, if it'll improve the soil and some of these things that they're looking at throughout the state. And there's this kind of diagram. They have soybeans, wheat, and corn, and where they plant the winter hardy and winter killed cover crops. And this went for 5 years. It concluded this last fall. But I'm going to show some of the results of it. The first year, the soybeans, they basically yield the same. If you have the same letter after, it means they're not statistically different. I mean, they may have a little different numerically, but if the numbers are the same, that means they're statistically the same. They were just different by chance regardless. So basically the soybeans are about the same. In this field, there's a little slope. The soybeans this first year were kind of, I think they were more down at the bottom, and wheat was kind of in the middle. Wheat actually was excellent this first year. It made like 90 bushels an acre, over 90 bushels. But the corn, we had a period in there where it was up on the sloping land, was not quite as good a soil, and had some stress during the summertime, and so there was an effect in actually the winter hardy where the rye was growing. It tasseled a few days later, and you can see the statistically different. There's like a 15 bushel difference, and over about a 50 bushel or $50 net return difference there as well. So that top part wasn't as good. Then the next year was in soybeans. It was corn out soybeans, and then wheat's the system. And the soybeans, the same thing. You could see during the year there was soybeans were under stress where the winter hardy cover crops were planted, and it showed up in yield. There's 6 bushel yield difference, and almost $42 difference in net return per acre regard to that. So that was statistically different. The corn yields, they were down in the bottom part, that area where I showed where all the earthworms were, and then they yielded excellent. It was 240 bushel land. This is dry land, excellent yields, and no difference statistically between either treatment. And then they had the winter hardy and winter terminated the next year, and this was where the soybeans were down at the bottom, and excellent yields that year as well, basically the same as far as that goes. So this is the third year of the study. And the fourth year, the third year of the corn, they were basically the same as well. No statistical difference, but excellent yields again in 2019. That was that wet year. He usually wants to get usually a corn is planted in the first couple of weeks of April, maybe, in that area. And then he terminates the rye, usually, 7 to 10 days before he plants. And the rye is maybe, 6 to 12 inches tall. So he doesn't let it get real tall. And in regard to that, and then the beans, he likes to plant those. He terminates the rye, a week or two before. He wants to get those planted by the 1st of May, because the research has shown that you can lose yield if you don't get them planted around that time. So he really timely in getting those planted. And then in 2020, soybean yields were basically the same. He had very good yields, and very good net return. And then the corn yields, which was on that upper area, this is kind of going back around where we had a 15 bushel difference. This year, there was no significant difference in 2020, the corn yields. And there was difference in marginal net return, but it was not statistically different. Now this last year, I don't have those available, but there was no difference in the soybean or corn. They were all the same. So basically from that first year when the cover crops were first planted, there was statistically difference between corn and then the next year for soybeans. But then we went around in a cycle, then basically the yields were the same. And so it just takes some time for the cover crops to, show some benefit for the soil health aspect of it in regard to that on that soil that's not quite as as good in regard to that. And this just shows an example how this is the oats, and brassicas growing right here in front, and off the left is the rye and Nebraska. It's just the competition wise how that works. We do take a small sample out of there just kind of get an idea on how much dry matter is produced, about 3 by 3 square, and we take 4 of those for the field, and then analyze those, see how much biomass we have there, and looking at that. And usually we get about a half a ton or so, or I should say about a ton, not quite, from the winter hardy, where the rye and the turnips, and the winter terminated, which is the oats, about 1.5 tons. And then we harvest a little bit in the spring, about 1/3 of a ton. So you add the winter hardy all total, it's about 1.3 tons, and about 1.5 tons for the oats as far as tonnage. But some people will let the rye get a lot bigger, but Daryl, he wants to get it all there, so don't want to affect the crop yield, but it has been beneficial over time. And then I actually been collecting samples from other farmers in southeast Nebraska, from 9 different fields from farmers that planted rye. Harvested from April 11th to May 17th. And the low yield was actually Daryl's about 1/3 of an acre. The high yield was about 2 1/3 acres, and averaged a little over a ton per acre. And you can see a lot of carbon, almost high about a ton, and then nitrogen over 100 pounds that, from that rye, that's, going to go on the soil, be beneficial, and an average of a half a ton. And so there's quite a bit of a crop there. And then also this in 2020, I had 8 fields that I sampled, and from a half a ton to over 2.5 tons there, and averaged about 1.5 tons over all these 8 fields. But you see, it was the numbers here, a little over a ton there for carbon and nitrogen, and also as far as phosphorus and potassium, a lot of nutrients, that's just kind of recycling it out of the soil and going back in the soil, especially if it was grazed, it'll go right back in the soil. And there, and I also want to look at the feed value for people that do graze, and a number of people, especially like with the rye, and they have livestock, they will harvest that as a forage, usually put it up as a silage, small grain silage, and it's pretty good quality. On average, we did some this spring. I don't have these numbers, but it was about average 14%, which is excellent as far as crude protein. And you see it's 165%. That's excellent as far as energy value. So very good feed value for livestock, and they still get benefits. A lot of the research is seeing a lot of benefits are from the root exodus that the roots are excreting into the soil. Some of the benefits holding the soil together and benefiting it that way, but there's still a tremendous amount to learn. And one thing we did look at, where we plant some of these cover crops, we had the spring or after wheat, and some of the one treatment was a lot of, this is millet, but a lot of the summer annual forages like Sudan or Sudex, some of these type of thing, or forage sorghums, and but they needed some nitrogen. So we're looking at nitrogen. We added 50 pounds, see if that made a difference. Well, where we added 50 pounds of nitrogen, because after wheat, there's hardly any nitrogen left. The wheat scavenges most of it. And by just adding 50 pounds, we got about 3 times the production of forage, from this. So sometimes just a little boost can help out, especially in those. And it all depends on what your goal is. But if you're going to graze it, that would benefit. And this just shows, this was in 2020, where we planted, we had very good conditions as far as, we had to harvest the wheat off mid-July. We planted it, a couple days later, and then we had like an inch or 2 of rain, and then everything come out. This is like a 14-way mix. These yellow flowers are what we call sun hemp. it's not, related to marijuana or anything. It's a legume. So it produces a lot of nitrogen in there. And then there's millet in there. There's some forage, but a tremendous amount of residue here. And then they're grazed. And then what we were doing to see what activity in the soil was. So one thing we looked at, in October, we buried these cotton squares to see if they would disappear. And then we put those in October. We dug them up in March, and there was still activity. And we'll actually remember how cold it was in the winter, 30 below or so. Well, the ground, we had snow on top, it didn't even freeze. And I think the one treatment was a nitrogen. We had the most activity there because some of the legumes overwintered, but the soil didn't even freeze. And we dug those up in March. And I think we looked at kind of what disappearance was. Program we're looking at kind of Photoshop where we could see how much was left. And it was like 28% disappearance. So even during the winter months from October through March, there's activity going on there in regard to that. And then we did some in the summer too. And basically there's nothing left. We did it in the summertime. But the one treatment, I think it was the carbon treatment, we actually only had about a 1% loss. And we're looking at, there was a cotton, the guy with some fungi growing on the squares. So there was only like a 1% loss, but there was actually gained some growth on there, which was kind of interesting in there. But there's, like I said, there's still lots of new. I know other people were doing this thing, looking at that, and nobody had ever done it in the winter before, which was kind of ironic. But you see here, this is from the fall, the biomass, the nitrogen fixing mix, and some of the nitrogen. I'm trying to see what it has cowpea in there, the sun hemp, soybeans, vetch, pea, and oats. Pretty much every has oats and buckwheat in there. Buckwheat is good at recycling the soil and bringing phosphorus up to the soil and making it more available. And then early graze, there's some of the summer forages in there. Compaction fighter has a lot of, turnips, radishes. And then sunflowers have a deep tap root, and then it actually has okra in some of these. And the high carbon, it has a lot of the forage things like, sorghum, sudan, pearl millet, grain sorghum, sunf, and then it has okra in there, sunflowers, flax, and these other ones. So there's a lot of different things, but you see the high carbon and the early grays, they have very high yields, while the summer forages, a lot of growth on them, but you're putting a lot of carbon in the soil, and available. And then these were grazed later too as well. The CNN ratio was high. They had them longer to break down, and they were also grazed. And these were planted after wheat last year. But this just shows an example of all the different species coming up in there. And then, but just finishing up now, this is basically showing that you can plant cover crops in anything. This is actually my home area. We have an old cow lot where we plant pumpkins and stuff, but we plant tomatoes and peppers, mostly tomatoes, in these tires that we have, these old tires, and we fill them up with soil. And then we planted Syrah rye in here about a month or so ago and watered it in. And we have about 40 tires overall, but this shows it's coming up, and we'll let the rye get, almost heading out, and then cut it off, and then plant the tomatoes in there, and protects, kind of helps recycle the soil, but the roots and from the tomatoes. But you can use it, and we hope to disc up the remainder of the garden where we plant pumpkins and plant rye in that as well, because it helps suppress a lot of the weeds and helps kind of make the soil, kind of a crop rotation type thing, the soil healthier. So you can use it for anything and any type of garden as well. So I did want to share this link. We have a lot of good resources available on cover crops, and there's a lot of information available here. So thanks for listening. Hopefully you were able to gain something from this webinar. I guess here's one question I can see here. What can be planted as a cover crop? Well, there's a lot of different things you can plant as a cover crop. I mean, and sometimes it's not going to cost, and on average, I guess they would say, well, maybe, I mean, I'm just looking at a farm, maybe $20, $25, $30 an acre on average, but you can plant just oats. I mean, bin run oats you can plant, and which is pretty cheap, and rye or wheat, these are things that you can plant. I mean, rye and wheat will over winter, and then even like grain sorghum too, or even corn. You can plant these as cover crop. You have some corn things like that, but and then soybeans. But like buckwheat, that's something that's that's not so easy to seed to get, but some of these other things, it's easy for them to get these type of things. The sun hemp and like okra, that's a garden plant, but and then barley, these are other ones. And vetch, some of these are you may have to go maybe to a farm store or whatever, but the garden things, some of those things you can get like at Orsolans or Tractor Supply maybe, and some of these are maybe Earl May, some of these things. What does plow pan, compaction, and cover crops help to real? Well, plow pan, that's basically, how deep you plow. And, a lot of times, if you go that every, maybe it's 8 inches, maybe it's 12 inches every year, there's going to be a kind of a layer. And a lot of times it's just where the disc, I mean, a lot of times not too many people plow anymore. They'll just be disking, but it'll be at that level, maybe 6 inches. And, yeah, definitely some of these, I mean, it's where the tillage is, basically the depth of the tillage is kind of just the terminology there. But if you can, some of these different like radishes and turnips and rapeseed or canola seed, those are, they have good kind of a root system. I mean, rye and oats have, root system that's very fibrous and goes out. And like you saw, the rye goes down, very deep, but then also even sunflowers and the okra and even the turnips, they'll go down. Or I should say the radishes go down, straight down in there, and kind of help break up the plow pan or tillage pan, you want to call that. Well, what kind of legumes? Well, I mean, if you plant it in the summertime, and then, say you had a garden and you didn't want to plant anything until fall, you could plant some of these warm season legumes like soybeans, the cowpea. Some of these guys do cowpea in there, or you could plant the clovers. I mean, a lot of these clovers and vetches as well. I mean, they can produce quite a bit of nitrogen. And you saw all the different ones, like that yellow that was sun hemp. I mean, generally it never goes to seed here because it grows in the south, but it can produce tremendous amount of nitrogen. Like, I mean, if you planted a solid stand, it'd be like a couple 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre on that. And soybeans, and then field pea is something more in the fall. You can plant field pea if you get it in the soil. Some of those will overwinter, but there are some kind of peas that, and so there's a number of different things. Clover, I mean, a lot of times back when I was a kid, the farmers would plant sweet clover. A lot of times you'll see it growing along the side of the road, but sweet clover, and that's usually a biennial, where the first year it'll come up, and then the next year it'll come up and make seed. That's usually the yellow. It'll get maybe 5 foot tall and produce a lot. And then the farmers, when I was, in high school, we'd plow that up then, and then we plant wheat in there in the fall. But it's not used so much anymore. But and there's red clover as well. all different kinds of clover, but there's several kinds of legumes that can be planted in regard to that. And then where can you cover crop seed be purchased? Well, I mean, locally, maybe Google cover crop seed, but I know, you may be able to get some at some of the local, like like Earl may have some, or maybe Orchlands have some of those things, but also, I mean, some I mean, if you Google some of those, you might find some, but like Stock Seed Farm. And I know there's a couple smaller guys around Omaha that sell seed, and or if you maybe go to a co-op in some of the towns and stuff, they can they'll be able to get some for you as far as that goes. Regard to that. This is how many years can you use cover crop before changing another crop? Well, that's interesting. And then actually, some people, they almost plant cover crops continuously. There was a research project. Well, a farmer, I mean, if he was planting a cover crop in there, they were doing research looking to see the soil. He was southeast Nebraska. I really wasn't making enough money planting, like corn or grain sorghum. I mean, the soil was fairly poor, and trying to see if he could improve it by planting a cover crop. So he just planted cover crops in there, and then he grazed it. Well, a lot of it just reseeded itself, and he'd plant some more each year. And I think he did that for at least 4 or 5 years. And so, but he would have to supplement it and plant a little bit each year, but he was grazing it, so he was getting some benefit out of it. And I asked him, because he wasn't really making any money by, planting a cash crop like corn or soybeans or sorghum in there, or wheat. But he was, at the end of the study, the soil was being improved significantly, but he was going back. I think it was going to go back into permanent perennial grass after that. So you can plant it as one. And some people in orchards, I know they were planting rye between the rows and basically letting it reseed itself. And, it's kind of basically sustaining itself that way, but it's also suppressing a lot of the weeds, like I mentioned earlier. So it could be planted for a long time as far as that goes. But a lot of times people will plant a cover crop and, maybe continuously, and then they'll harvest something else and plant one later on. You said, can cover crops be planted now? Yeah, I can do that. About the only one I would probably plant now, would probably be rye, cereal rye. And I know a lot of times you can get that from the local co-ops. I mean, one of the co-ops is Frontier Co-op. I mean, that's a big one in eastern Nebraska. But that's where I got some, because I'm going to plant some in my pumpkins there. That's about, and in the spring, you could plant oats in there. I mean, you could put stuff, I mean, sometimes they call it frost seeding. You could plant, or dormant seeding, when it's cold, and, you can plant it in there and then it'll come up in the spring, or some people plant stuff on the snow, like maybe oats or a clover, even do that type of thing. Yeah, I can send that. I can put that thing on a website on there. So, well, thanks. I'm glad you guys could participate, and hopefully you thought you gained something from it. But I will say, yeah, definitely, there's a lot of good information from this at this link. Because and there's a lot of things you can just go there and find information on that. Just a second here. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I wanted to put that website on in the chat. Could you do that? Well, just a second.
And Gary, if it's too complicated for you to do it right now, we have all the emails and can send it out to everyone in a follow-up email as well, all the resources that you mentioned.
Okay, yeah, I don't know, I copied it, but it didn't, it's not going in there for some reason. I don't know if there's any more questions. Okay, how many people are using cover crops? Well, it's pretty small, actually. I'd say maybe 2 or 3%. I don't know, it's pretty small, but you know, it's increasing. You know, they're looking at, I mean, nationally, and then some of the other states to the east of us have really bought in on it, and you know, like, but see the benefit. And it's kind of more working the other way, where the biggest concern here is under irrigation. It makes a lot of sense because you don't have to worry about not having enough. But here, where you'd have dry land, it's a concern that you're going to dry your soil out too much and hurt your yields on that. And but there they get so much rain, it helps dry it out, and you know, they're seeing the benefit. The stuff don't flood out, and the rains don't run off, and so but through time it's just going to take some time. And I think over more, like I said, people that are using livestock are really seeing the benefits. So I think as far as that goes, but yeah, there's a lot of good resources out there that are available to people. And SARE, which I work for SARE, they have a tremendous amount of stuff on cover crops on that. So I don't know if there's any more questions. I didn't see any more.
Well, if you're
Yeah.
all finished up, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here today. And thank you, Gary, for taking the time to educate us about cover crops. We really appreciate it. Gary, if you have anything else.
Well, you could, I mean, I'm willing to, that's my job. You can give people my email.
Okay.
And I'm willing to help them provide information. I mean, because that's my job. Do that, and on different things. So have them feel free to, you know, email me if they got questions on different things, and go from there. And yeah, if you put it on the recording available, and let me know, and we can make that so I can let people know on that too.
All right, awesome. We'll get your email sent out then. So if anyone has any further questions, they can email you. Well, if there's nothing else, I hope everyone has a great rest of their evening. Enjoy the nice weather that we're having this week before we kind of get into those colder days. And thank you all again for being here.
Thank you, guys, and thank you for letting me do this. We'll see ya. Feel free to email me anytime or call. Bye.